Good evening, you're with ET now. This is the India development debate and straight to the big debate tonight. Move over fiscal fundamentalism. It is growth that matters. The economic survey, which was tabled by Finance Minister Arun Jaitley in Parliament today, gives enough indication that it is time to hit the pause button when it comes to fiscal fundamentalism. The survey, authored by Chief Economic Advisor Arvind Surbramanian, says GDP growth is likely to be in a range of 7 to 7.5% next fiscal. For this year, the GDP growth is pegged at 6.75%, a marked increase from the CSO's estimated 6.5%. Looks like the authors of the survey are not really amused by the bull run on the Dalal Street, as they want the government to stay vigilant on a possible sudden correction in stock prices which could reverse capital flows.
Indeed. On the flip side, the slow pace of job creation and the spike in oil prices are the biggest concerns highlighted in the survey, pointing to the need for policy vigilance. The survey says oil prices could rise by as much as 12% the next fiscal year, posing a big challenge to economic management in the coming year. There is a word of caution on the dwindling output from the farm sector, which could face the brunt from sudden climate changes. Setting the agenda for the next phase of reforms, the survey says the focus should shift to stabilising the GST collections and meeting divestment targets, including privatisation of the national carrier Air India. With the budget 2018 just a few days away, what are the key pointers from the economic survey to that big event? That's a big topic of discussion right here on the India development debate tonight. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. We've got Ruchi Bhatia first up with more details of what the survey has said, the areas it has highlighted, and the discourse it is now going to set.
India is all set to regain the top spot as the world's fastest growing economy in the world, and that according to the Chief Economic Advisor's economic survey. Now they are looking at 6.75% growth in FY18, which means the government is looking at topping the CSO's own estimate for FY18 of 6.5%, and as far as FY19 is concerned, we are looking at 7 to 7.5%. Now this is mainly going to be possible because look at the kind of increase that we have seen in the number of taxpayers post the goods and services tax. In fact, the government is hoping that the goods and services tax will stabilize in the near term, and apart from that, India's exports are also going to be very competitive. Exports will move up briskly, and that will help the economy going forward. But amidst so much optimism, where are the risks really coming in from? Crude prices could be a risk going forward. The way crude prices are moving means the government will have to be more watchful of the kind of impact it will have on inflation, on current account deficit, and of course fiscal deficit. And the second big concern is the kind of spike that we have seen in bond yields. In fact, the Chief Economic Advisor is saying that the government needs to be more vigilant about the current market rally. In the previous economic surveys, we have seen several game-changing ideas like the universal basic income, the JAM Trinity, what the government needs to do with respect to the twin balance sheet problem. And this time around, the key themes really were the push with respect to agriculture, the kind of impact that climate change is having on agriculture, and of course the Chief Economic Advisor spoke about the need for judicial reforms at a time like this, how this will push the economy going forward, and of course gender equality. That was the reason that the economic survey this time around was pink in color. So whole host of things that the government has spoken about in its report card this time around.
All right, that's Ruchi Bhatia with the broad highlights of the survey there. But joining us right here on the India Development Debate is a stellar panel. Rajiv Kumar, Vice Chairman of Niti Aayog, joins us. Sajid Chinoy, Asia Economics of JP Morgan. Mr. Sunil Kant Munjal, Chairman Hero Corporate Service. Shobna Kamineni, President CII. R. Jagannathan, Editorial Director, Swarajya Magazine. Thanks each one of you for being with us this evening on the show with us. And I will take it straight across to Dr. Rajiv Kumar. You represent the government on the show tonight. Is the survey being a little conservative considering global growth is picking up, both on this year's growth at 6.75% and next year's at 7 to 7.5%? Or do you believe this is perhaps the level of growth that we are going to see? We need to make our peace with 7.5%, and sub 8% growth is perhaps a reality that we need to live with.
I think, Supriya, that this is economic survey at its conservative best, and to talk about 7 to 7.5%, I think is an underestimate. I would expect the growth to be between 7.5 to 8% for sure, And the reasons I'm saying this are the following. One, our investment cycle seems to have perked up already. The non-food credit offtake, which the survey puts it at 8.5% until November, in November 2017 is now, I know, has gone up to 11.8 or 11.9% in December, and is picking up all the time. Our corporate bonds have increased by 17%. We have had a record IPO year. So the investment cycle, the private investment, has finally turned around, and that will continue to go up, and that will therefore result in a higher growth rate. That's one. The second thing is that, as you said yourself, the world trade is going to be increasing at more than 4% after a very long time. There is a synchronous recovery in the Americas, Europe and Japan, and I don't see why India should not be taking advantage of this buoyancy in world growth and world trade. And so therefore our exports, I would hope we will do everything possible to ensure that our exports rise by around 20% as they have done in the past. The Prime Minister has also talked about shifting to an export driven strategy, and I think whatever is required for doing that, whether it is on the exchange rate front, whether it is in terms of improving the chances of our labor intensive exports by extending the package in the textile sector to other sectors, or its terms of trade logistics and trade facilitation, for which there is now a fresh department within the Ministry of Commerce that has been established. So export growth, net exports hopefully being positive after a long time would be the other big driver. The third driver, of course, Supriya, will be domestic consumption demand, which has begun to rise, and I think again here you will see that that both urban and rural economies will power that consumption demand. So on the basis of all those three, I think that that the economic survey's expectations will thankfully be breached in terms of growth in FY19.
Mr. Munjal, comment on that. Would you agree with the optimistic assessment there of Dr. Rajiv Kumar of us likely to touch 8% growth in FY19, which is of course going to be the election year, so to say? Or do you think the Chief Economic Advisor is sort of being cautiously optimistic by pegging it at around 7 to 7.5%? What's your own estimate on growth for the next financial year, and are there enough levers for us to do that 8% mark?
So first, I'd like to agree with most of the things that Rajiv is saying. One, that consumption has started to turn around and it's showing an improvement. Two, the global economy turning around is a big plus right now for India as we are going into our growth phase ourselves. Now, whether the number is 7, 7.5 or 8, I think is a little bit less important than the growth momentum, I think, which is critical right now, because we had a pretty tough time for a while now. And especially on the asset creation side, gross capital formation has fallen in India continuously quarter on quarter, every quarter for the last 14 except a quarter and a half. So I think that is one thing on which we still need to focus. And the other important one is to ensure that all this growth comes with increased economic opportunities and jobs. I think a combination of these for us is very critical, but clearly the mood is much better today than it was 6 months ago. The changes which took place due to GST, etc., have added a very significant number of new players in the formal economy. You have a larger number of taxpayers. This also came out in the economic survey. So when you club some of these factors together, clearly India is getting back onto a growth path. And while we've had amongst the highest growth in the world, also in the recent past, but the reality is for us as a nation, it's not enough. We need higher growth. In fact, our mantra for the next 15 or 20 years has got to be growth, job creation, rural economy, higher productivity in all three sectors: services, industry and agriculture.
Fair point indeed, but I do want to touch upon the other big headline from this survey. And Dr. Rajiv Kumar, before I take it across to Sajid Chinoy and Jaggi and Ms. Shobna Kamineni on this, I do want to quickly turn to the fiscal deficit part of this. And the survey talks about, the possibility of the of a pause on fiscal consolidation for this year. It also goes on to say in FY19, if we were to have ambitious fiscal targets, this is not going to garner us credibility. Do you believe in a lot of ways the survey is laying the ground for some fiscal slippage, and will a 20 to 30 basis point slippage really make a difference to investments that it is supposed to make? I mean, you know, we will let the fisc expand in quest of growth, but will it really make a substantial difference?
Of course, yes. I mean, that is what the survey is saying. The survey is saying that let's get real this time. We've had some major structural reforms in the system, demonetization, GST, insolvency, Benami Act, you know, the DBT, etc., and all of those put pressure, especially the GST have put pressure on the tax collections, and therefore, and everywhere in the world, the economies take up to 2 years to get adjusted to a new tax regime as ambitious as the GSTs, and we have done well, but we are still adjusting. So for all those reasons, I think the fiscal deficit glide path would be a different one for FY18 and FY19. This is not, and this should not be a cause of any concern whatsoever. I think we have suffered far too long with fiscal fundamentalism, and it has not, and we, as you will see, this bit of slippage doesn't cause any threat to our overall macroeconomic stability. So I think the survey is simply stating the fact that fiscal deficit is not the only indicator of macroeconomic stability, and it may slip this year, as is also permitted under the NK Singh committee report, and therefore and I'm sure the markets as well as the investors and credit rating agencies will take it in their stride and not get overtly concerned about it.
Well, that's a provocative statement you're making, and I know we've got two panelists who have sort of slightly differing views on the word quote-unquote fiscal fundamentalism. Let me take it to Sajid Chinoy first. Sajid, obviously markets have priced in some amount of fiscal slippage if you look at the movement of bond yields over the last couple of months. So markets have priced in some amount of fiscal slippage. How are you reading the commentary of the economic survey on the fiscal deficit? Is the chief economic advisor sort of indicating that there is a case for some amount of slippage and that markets should make their peace with it both for this financial year and for the next?
Hi, good evening. Well, let me start by saying it's a very credible, very honest, very balanced, very provocative economic survey, so all that one can ask for. You know, on the fiscal, I think we should not be ideological about this. I completely agree with Mr. Kumar, but I think the concern right now is more pragmatic and less ideological, and let me tell you what I mean by that. You know, I think the one big risk that is on the horizon is oil prices. India is very dependent on oil prices. Oil prices have gone up almost 40% in the last 4 months. And that has two implications. One is that it will temper any growth recovery next year. The survey also pointed to this. Our own sense is that this 20% increase in oil prices year on year, if oil remains at $70, you know, may shave off 40 or 50 basis points of growth next year. But I think the bigger concern is, you know, India has for the last 4 or 5 years been seen as this beacon of macroeconomic stability. Around the world, you know, India is considered the safe haven in emerging markets. And, you know, I think policymakers have been very responsible, but the fact is with this large move up in commodity and oil prices, you're just seeing some signs of macroeconomic pressures. You know, if oil remains at the current level, the current account deficit next year could be, you know, 2.7% of GDP. Core inflation is now tracking an annualized momentum of 6%. So just, you know, early signs of some pressures. Now on the fiscal, I think the concern has been that it's not really the center. The center has been, you know, quite responsible in the last few years, but the fact is the absorptive capacity of the market has been exhausted, and that's why in the last 4 months what you're seeing is bond yields have sold off more than 100 basis points. Now, why does this matter? It matters because at a time when the banking system is under stress, more and more companies are raising money in the corporate bond market. That's become the de facto source of funding to the corporate sector. And remember, corporate bond yields are priced off government bond yields. So when government bond yields go up by 100 basis points, corporate bond yields have risen in sympathy. So the Reserve Bank cut rates by 25 basis points in August, but corporate bond yields have gone up by 60 basis points in the last 3 months. That's tantamount to 2 rate hikes. So essentially what's happening is some of the fiscal pressure is pushing up the cost of borrowing for the private sector, and that's why this is so directly linked to growth prospects in the future. Now let me end by saying, we should not be fundamental about this. This was an exceptional year. The government only has access to 11 months of GST revenue. So if the fiscal were to slip this year, I think that markets will willingly accept. The key is going to be markets are forward looking. What happens to next year's fiscal? If all the reason for this year's slippage is temporary shortfalls, then by definition those won't exist next year. So markets would expect the government to get on to a fiscal consolidation path. So I think if there is a glide path for the deficit coming down next year and the assumptions are credible, I think markets will be okay with that. The very last thing I'll say is I think in a pre-election year, revenue assumptions become all important because it's unlikely that the government will cut expenditure running into an election. So it's important that on Thursday not only is there a glide path for the deficit coming down, but also the assumptions underpinning it on the revenue side are credible.
All right, fair point indeed. But let me take this across to R. Jagannathan. And Jaggi, do you share Sajid's view that perhaps this year some slack can be cut because it has been an exceptional year in terms of rollout of the GST and all that? What is important is what is the glide path for the next fiscal year, and if that's not going to show a downward trend, markets will not read too much into the credibility of this. So the only thing is that the economic survey says that an ambitious fiscal deficit target for fiscal year 19, which is next financial year, is not going to garner credibility either. So in some sense, the economic survey is saying that there will be fiscal loosening this year as well as next year. But what's your view? Do you believe the markets will be kinder this year thanks to the rollout of the GST and the disruption caused on account of that, but stakeholders will not be as kind for next year? At least that's what Sajid's view is.
I think the problem has been we don't have two kinds of fundamentalisms going on.
I really think there's a problem with the feed there. If I can go across and pose the same question to Shobana Kamineni. And Ms. Kamineni, the point that Sajid Chinoy has made there about fiscal deficit and the survey laying ground for some fiscal slippage, that is about 20 to 30 basis points, will that make a big difference? I mean, I know corporate India on one hand believes that fiscal fundamentalism and this kind of a hawkish attitude on the fisc perhaps is not warranted. The government should spend more. But what's your own take on it?
I don't think it will make a difference at all at that point. So we were supposed to get to 3.2, holding it at 3.5, very creditable. And the fact that this economy is investment led. We do need the government to continue spending.
Okay. Fair point. We'll try and fix Jaggi's audio. Quick word on crude and then we get reactions from the panel as well. Dr. Rajiv Kumar, survey points to the concern, and Sajid spoke about it as well, the headwind on account of rising crude oil prices, and survey has pointed out on the need for increased policy vigilance. What kind of vigilance is that likely to be? What, according to you, are the challenges ahead for the economy in 2018, and what kind of vigilance is that likely to be? Could we go back to the era of sort of, subsidy management of fuel prices? What's your view? How is that likely to be managed?
Global crude oil prices have hardened beyond expectations. Some people tell me that this might well be because a huge oil company is ready to get into the market, ready to sort of issue its IPO, and therefore that listing requires higher crude oil prices, and as soon as this listing is over, and I'm here talking about the Saudi Aramco proposed listing, then the crude oil prices, the scenario may well take a different, may well become different altogether. I also am quite surprised as to why at 60, 65 the US shale oil has not come into it in a very big way, and so that I hope that will also happen. So I am one of those who believes that this hardening of crude oil prices is rather how do I say, transitory and not really based on any big rise in demand, etc. Also, I think some more crude might well be on its way from both Iraq and Russia. So, crude oil prices, I am not one of those who wants to be alarmist at this stage. At the same time, it is quite true that India should be prepared, that the bonanza that we had experienced in the last 3 years will not be there for us to sort of take, and therefore we should prepare ourselves for improving energy efficiency, ramping up domestic energy production, getting our renewables even further up, etc., so that our dependence on imported oil does not go up any more. But also the fact that our exports will in some sense benefit. I don't like to count oil, like petroleum product exports, as a major sort of component of our export, because one, they are not labor intensive, and two, we just getting a sort of refinery margin on it. But nonetheless, if the crude oil prices go up, our petroleum product exports values will go up. So that will be a saving grace. And this should not be a cause for anybody to argue for any real appreciation of the rupee, saying that that will help us keep our energy import bill down. I think our export driven strategy is far more important, and hopefully therefore any argument for oil prices finding its way into an appreciating rupee would be quite wrong. So the challenges for the Indian economy going forward, I think, remain the same. Agriculture growth, growth in farmers' income. I stand corrected. We must focus on growth of farmers' income. Then the second one, of course, is even more employment in the formal sector than that has been brought out by Ghosh and Ghosh, which is already quite substantial. The third will be our health and education sectors, because that's where the human resource is the resource for tomorrow, and that is where I think we need to take a lot more action than what we have done in the past.
I get your point, and I guess you're defending the government's actions there, but I want to spend some time talking about the policy vigilantism that the survey speaks about, both in markets and crude, and I'll deal with crude for just a bit. And Jaggi, before we lost you on that question on Fisk, we moved to crude oil, and the policy, the economic survey does send red flags crude oil prices. It says crude will go up by about 12% in the next financial year, and it also states in the same breath that there needs to be policy vigilance if crude oil prices do shoot up more than what the government anticipates. Now, policy vigilance of a kind that I don't understand. I mean, when we had the benefit, we didn't really share it with consumers. The policy in the UPS time was 1/3 share by consumer, company and the government. Are we going to go back and see that happen? Because I'm presuming when we did not share the benefits, we cannot share the burden of crude oil prices. So will we see some amount of subsidy burden being borne by the government and perhaps losses being incurred by oil majors? I mean, how do you see this expand? And because that is the only prescription of policy vigilantism that comes to my mind on this.
Look, I don't see the government giving up all its tax gains merely because oil prices are going to go. I think it will share a part of the gains with the consumer as oil prices rise, and if oil prices rise. If the rise is only up to the level of 12%, I don't see the government giving up any of its excise benefits. But if it starts rising beyond that, it will have to share some of the gains, because otherwise it will have an impact on local inflation, and consumption-led story will start stalling, and many other things will keep happening. I think so. I think that's the only thing I can see. Only if there is some runaway rise in prices, then the government has to worry. Anything that rises from up to 10 to 20%, I think will get handled by the economy without any problem. I think that's what, beyond that I can't see. I mean, if it goes to $80 and all, then we have a different kind of problem. But I don't see that happening as of now. As Rajiv Kumar said, I think you should see shale oil and all coming into the business at the right price. I think maybe they're just waiting for the right moment. And I think once the US tax cuts and other things happen, I think the US economy will be booming. So shale oil will come back into thing, and gas also will start coming in. I think that's what we're likely to see. I don't think we are going to see any runaway rise in that. Keep your fingers crossed though. Huh?
Sure. Mr. Munjal, I'm coming to you in just 30 seconds. I want to get a quick reaction from Sajid Chana on the other red flag in the report, which is the boom in the stock market. Sajid and the survey warns that bond yields are steeply high and again speaks of policy vigilance if stock markets correct sharply. A, do you think markets are racing ahead of the fundamentals? And more importantly, what policy vigilance is the government here, chief economic advisor here, potentially referring to?
I think it's good for us to just remind ourselves that, these things can turn quickly on a dime. We saw this in 2011-12. We had got a little bit complacent of the macroeconomics, and then suddenly the current account more than doubled to almost 5% of GDP. So I think the economic survey actually does us a service by just saying that there's been a lot of focus on growth, but let's not forget that under the radar, some of these macroeconomic pressures are rising. Now again, I don't want to sound alarmist. I don't think any of these have reached the point, apart from the bond market, that need any urgent attention now. But on oil prices, for example, it will be important that a lot of this is passed on to households, not just because that will save some fiscal space, but what you want is when prices go up, you want households to adjust volumes. Otherwise, you're in a situation where there is no price elasticity of consumption or investment, and it shows up largely in the current account deficit. So I think that is my biggest concern here, that if oil remains at $70 a barrel, and it could, a lot of global forecasters now are saying that 60 becomes sort of a floor, 70 may well be the average for 2018, then the current account deficit, just to put this in perspective, last year was $15 billion a year. This year is on track to be $50 billion, and next year $75 billion. I think that's where we need to be a little bit more careful, because that $75 billion, India then needs a lot of portfolio flows to finance the current account deficit, and then you become hostage to the vagaries of global markets, risk on and risk off. So I don't think there's any urgent attention now, but I think all the more reason, to the extent that the government has some fiscal space, highlighting a path of fiscal consolidation, having a medium-term fiscal anchor to which global investors can, peg their hat on, will be important to calm any fears here that even as oil goes to 70, policymakers have things under control.
I don't think I can agree more with you on the structural fault line as far as the current account deficit and where its underlying is concerned. But I'll take it across to Mr. Munjal. And Mr. Munjal, talking about global growth, the IMF believes global growth is going to clock levels of 3.9%. That is, of course, a tailwind for our exports. Now, if you actually look at exports, it perhaps hasn't leveraged that global growth enough. For our economy to be in that 8% growth trajectory, we need higher imports, we need higher exports, and the economic survey very clearly says that we need to do all it takes to ensure that export grows by over 20%. What would your policy prescription on doing what it takes entails?
So one, to reconfirm the fact that you are stating, if you look even across Indian states, the states which export more are also the more prosperous states in India. There's an almost direct linkage, and that's quite interesting actually, and big data and data analytics is now able to show you all of this stuff. So exports is absolutely critical. I just want to go back to an earlier point which was being discussed by some of the speakers. I don't think we need to fear too much on the oil prices, while of course we need to become more efficient in our oil and energy usage, but the likelihood of oil prices staying at this level is very, very low. As Rajiv Kumar or somebody else mentioned the reasons for it, there is a very strong likelihood fracking in the US is actually, it's already begun, it will go up, larger oil flows will come in, and the oil price is bound to also drop as the winter starts to wane out. So I think our ability to manage our economy will be better than some of us fear. So our focus does need to get on higher production in India, in higher exports out of India, both of goods and services. So if we can do things like the policy that we were talking about, removing MAT from export zones, etc., I think we do need to focus on some of these. It is critical, it is important for us. We want to increase the overall share of manufacturing in our economy. We want to increase the share of exports overall in our economy. While we are a very external economy, over 40% of our economy is now external, but we need to strengthen what we are doing there. the value add to India, the GV add actually does need to go up. So you cannot stress the need enough to have any and every policy, because this is at a twin track now. It's not just policy at the center, it's also policy at the states, which goes right down to the fundamentals, even on labor policy. We have right now amongst the stiffest labor policies in the world, while we relaxed them some in the last few years, but we have some distance to go. There has been talk now in the last week or so of allowing units with 300 or less number of employees in the company to have much more relaxed norms. There is a test which was done in the textile industries on fixed term employment or fixed time employment that worked very well. We should take that across the industry. There are actually things that we can do, and they are reasonably well known. There is a need for us to get down to that implementation. We have focused on ease of doing business in many ways, but we have some distance to go still. The direction that we're in is absolutely correct. It is absolutely the right direction, but I think some of the pace needs to increase, and more importantly, the pace of implementation now needs to increase.
Ms. Kamini, any comment on that? Let's get another industry view, because Mr. Munjal also spoke on some of the reforms, and we should focus and talk about jobs as well. And the survey acknowledges the issue, the concern as far as job creation is concerned. Now, while the EPFO data has now fueled a fresh debate, and Dr. Rajiv Kumar was alluding to that earlier in the debate, the EPFO data has fueled a fresh debate on job creation. But there is no denying the fact that good quality job creation is not happening in the economy at large. What incentives do you think are needed to spur more investments in job creating sectors? Mr. Munjal spoke about some of them, but to your mind, what are the incentives needed to spur more investments in job creating sectors?
I really think that the private sector, this is the time when we need to come forward through better, just lowering corporate taxes will help increase investments. And when you have more investments and capacity building, that is one job creation. But the bulk of job creation will come when we start construction, the new cities that are coming up, the new infrastructure that is coming up, real estate, housing for all. Just remember that China, 55 to 60% was from construction related jobs as a whole. And then of course, at the same time, we're working on Industry 4.0 to see where reskilling will come from. So I think that these are two twin challenges, and the fundamental is education. I was very happy to see that in the economic survey, there was a strong emphasis on education.
Let's actually turn focus away from jobs. That is one red flag onto the other, and that has to be the agrarian sector, the rural farm stress. And Sajid, if I may come to you on that, the survey acknowledges that real farm income has grown by just 1 percentage point in the last 4 years. In fact, I think the release by Mr. Chidambaram, who was pointed out to that survey, also talks about agricultural income and that being a big failure on the part of this government, talks about its many ifs. At one level, do you believe the survey has failed to give path-breaking solutions to resolve the rural crisis? And at another level, do you believe the budget will have to have the remedy for that? And what would that remedy be to increase farm income? It's one thing to say we will double farm income by 2022, but how do you walk the talk on that?
I think the rural distress is real, and it's no surprise why you've seen over the last 4 or 5 years that the terms of trade have moved rapidly against agriculture, because food prices have come down much more than non-food prices. In addition, we've had 2 of the last 4 years being drought years. So now farmers have got buffeted not just by lower relative prices, but also by 2 years in which volumes didn't go up. I don't think we should spend much time trying to figure out what the right answer is. We know for years what the right answers are, whether it's rationalizing land holdings, whether it's increasing irrigation, whether it is buffering farmers from the time that if prices were to fall, the government must more aggressively procure so as to create some insurance on the downside. These are well-known solutions. Marketing so that perishables, 30 or 40% of perishables don't rot by the time they hit the market. Reducing the monopsonies at the farm gate level. The problems are well known. the solutions have been identified. I think the relevant question, which I think the survey hints at, is what is the political economy framework that we must adopt to try and ensure these things happen, right? And I think this is where the GST, to use one of the survey's phrases, the technology, the fiscal federalism, the cooperative fiscal federalism technology that the GST provided can perhaps be used to solve the problem of agriculture, because it is a state problem, it's also a central problem. The question is, how do you create the incentive compatibility for policymakers, both at the state level and the central level, to actually get these things done? If we just were to spend time listing out what the answers are, this would be the Xth number of time it's happened in the last 10 years. We know what the answers are. We need to figure out why hasn't it been done in the last decade or 2 or 3 decades, and what needs to change from the incentive compatibility of a policymaker to get these things done for farmers.
Can you comment on that? Is there political capital to the incentive capability that Sajid spoke about as far as policy makers are concerned? Because like Sajid pointed out, the answers are there for everyone in the political establishment across party lines, and yet we haven't seen those sort of decisions being taken from a structural point of view to fix this. Otherwise, every year we're going to look at incremental steps like hiking MSP or increasing farm outlays, or one more irrigation scheme, or one more sort of crop insurance scheme, but that's not going to do the job, is it? Jaggi?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely not. Because see, I think what we need to do are 3 things basically. First of all, I think this whole MSP business needs to be reduced at the central level and shifted to the states. The reason is, states know best what you need to do in terms of agricultural thing, in terms of producing the maximum thing. So you need to transfer that entire amount or the substantial amount beyond the core buffer stock to the state level. Second thing you need to do is, when some of these subsidies are reduced, you need to make it into a targeted, not universal basic income, targeted farm support income for farmers. The third thing you need to do is, actually, though you talked about shifting away from the jobs problem, but the point is, you cannot double farmers' income unless and until you reduce the number of farmers. So if you must have a plan to move 1/3 of farmers away from farming and related and dependence on the land. Once you do that, farm income will automatically double. So you have to actually increase the quantum of jobs that you created outside the farm. So these 3 things need to be combined in some posing. Once you do that, automatically the investments will start taking place in irrigation and bore wells and small lakes, and also the cold chains and everything, because farmers are the ones who need to start producing that investment, and not just the center. I think the state now needs to be the engine of farm growth, not the center. We need to disband this heavy cost oriented MSP structure, which is rice and wheat oriented. It needs to move to the state level. The center should concentrate only on creating the core buffer stock that you need, so that you don't end up with a basic food crisis. Once you do that, you must dismantle the FCI or give it to the states to handle. Some of these radical solutions need to be thought of, otherwise you will never get out of this trap of believing that only MSPs are the solution to farm incomes.
All right, fair point indeed, but I want to just touch upon some of the more forward-looking things. We've just got 10 odd minutes into this debate right now, and I want to talk about some of the priority areas that this survey seems to have identified. And Mr. Munjal, if I may ask you, some of the agendas for next year that the survey says, and I'm really curious to know, do you believe as a member of Indian industry these are the right ones? Support agriculture, stabilize GST, finish resolution plus recapitalization of banks, privatize Air India, head off macroeconomic pressures. So, big picture, obviously it's all very good, but what would you want to add into this list of agenda of things to do, and how would you want this to be prioritized?
First, I want to go back to the point which was being made, which is also linked to what you are saying. Our 2 biggest problems today in the rural economy, specifically in agriculture, are minimum support price and the APMC Act. These are both designed to protect and support farmers, and they actually hold back the entrepreneurship in the farm sector completely. If we can create a twin track system, which is incentivize those who do create higher productivity, cash crops, new products, new innovations, and then have an insurance policy at the bottom so nobody drops off below a certain minimum level of income or does not get impacted by natural calamities, etc. I think we can completely transform the agri sector, but that is not enough. We need to transform the rural economy. There is one sector in our economy which has been the largest driver of the Indian economy for centuries, which is now dying, which is the arts and crafts and our cultural heritage. Most of it resides in the villages. Our craft skills, the artisanal skills actually reside in villages, and now the young people are getting up and walking away to towns and cities because there is no, it's not remunerative any longer. So if we can get in there, provide a little bit of more design input, a little bit of more knowledge of how to produce better and linkage to markets, you have the potential to create the largest growth opportunity this country has ever seen, certainly much bigger than any 1, 2 or even 10 industries put together. And at this moment, our focus on that frankly is pretty near zero. And that has to be in parallel while improving the rural infrastructure, whether it's roads, it's drinking water, it's education and healthcare. So that's one set, I think, which is necessary, because without improving rural India, you cannot improve all of India. So I agree with the focus on agriculture, but I think we need to expand beyond agriculture to the overall rural economy. And as far as industry is concerned, we need to accelerate the pace of the ease of doing business initiatives. Now, Shobna spoke of incentivization of capital investment. I think it is necessary because we do need to create higher incentives for investment right now. We want like the old incentives which used to be there for a long time. I think you can create that with a slight twist, which is incentivize investment with a percentage of incentive on taxation. At the same time, those which create higher multipliers of jobs get a higher percentage over that, like we used to have in R&D and stuff like that. It may be a good idea to link it to jobs and job creation, and also on the side of new enterprises, the startups, etc. I think the list that was given to the government to implement as policy, I think a large part of that list has been implemented, but not all of it has. I think we did only about 2/3. There is some more work to be done there, because we have to encourage new startups to come in. We also have to understand and accept that many of them will fail. There are many countries, by the way, like the UK, etc., which incentivize people who invest in startups. In India, you get taxed on both sides. There are many countries like the US which encourage and give a tax break if you give a donation or philanthropy. In India, you get taxed. So I think some of our policies at this moment are upside down, especially considering what we need as a nation. So some of these are easy changes to make. These are not those which will have any drainage, any big drain on your resources. In fact, it can actually create productive capacity quite quickly. We've seen that it doesn't take more than a year or two for small investments to start showing effect, and 3 to 5 years for larger investments to start showing effect. We have to focus on removing what we've seen for a long time is a source of our inflation, which comes from the supply side. Now, in recent times, of course, our capacity utilization has been low, so supply constraint has not been there. But as soon as the consumption starts to get picked up, which is expected next year, we will hit a wall again in capacity. And at that time, it will be too late to start investing. So I hope and wish the investment cycle to create additional capacities across India will accelerate. I hope the idea of privatizing public sector enterprises will accelerate. I hope the idea of using resources which are sitting idle, like land with large number of public sector enterprises, will accelerate.
Couldn't agree more with many of those suggestions you made, especially the one on the rural sector. You know, we've done a lot of debates in this program on the agrarian crisis, and sort of that suggestion hasn't really come about. So a great idea to look at it from the art and craft point of view as well, and a more holistic approach to the rural economy than just focus on the farm sector. So appreciate those points.
I'm happy to share that in much more detail.
Sure, sir. Appreciate that perspective, Mr. Munjal. But quick point, the point that you made towards the end, Sajid, that I want your reaction to the point that Mr. Munjal made on sort of divesting some of these public sector holdings and Air India privatization. I'm glad to see that in the list of the chief economic advisor, there is some concern on whether the government has a political capital to go ahead with that, what could be a contentious move to sell Air India. Is that a no-brainer really for the government to look at asset monetization more aggressively, to look at other ways to monetize some more government assets and raise resources?
Absolutely. I think the one bright spot in this year's budget, among others, is that for the first time ever, we might be in a situation where the government exceeds its disinvestment target. So I think, full marks to the government for showing the resolve to meet and beat a pretty aggressive target for this year. I think for me, what I call an asset swap is a no-brainer here, because just let's step back and apart from the tactics of this budget, look forward towards the next 2 or 3 years. We clearly need in this country much more public investment, much more physical infrastructure, much more social infrastructure. Now the private sector is going to have a limited role to play in this, because many of these things have such positive externalities that sometimes they are underproduced by the private sector and necessarily need to be produced by the public sector, number one. Number two, even in cases where the private sector would have otherwise stepped in, given the leverage problem on balance sheets and the fact that, as the survey points out, this resolution process is going to take several quarters, I don't think the infrastructure private sector companies will be in a position to use their balance sheets for the next year or two. So I think the imperative that the government will have to do the heavy lifting is even greater than before. Now, how do you go about this? I think there are two ways to do this. One is to sell unproductive assets on your balance sheet, disinvestment, strategic asset sales, and replace that with more productive infrastructure, either physical or social. Right? This is just good corporate governance, because you're replacing unproductive assets with productive assets, and nobody can accuse you of selling your family silver to pay your credit card, so to speak. So this is an asset swap on the balance sheet. The other thing which I suspect you will see in this year's budget is a lot of this moving off balance sheet, where quasi-sovereign companies, NHAI, PFC, REC will raise more money from the market and invest that into infrastructure. I think that's another sensible thing to do. Of course, this increases the public sector borrowing requirement, so it is a drain on resources. What I'm hoping happens at some point in time is that in the corporate bond market, to accommodate this greater supply by quasi-sovereigns, we also gradually increase the foreigner limit of how much foreigners can hold. There's a lot of foreign interest in India's corporate bond market. The limit is almost full right now. There's a lot of latent demand globally. So this is the right time to channelize those resources from foreigners to absorb the new supply. The last thing I'll say is, again, to go back to the fiscal, everything has an opportunity cost. The more the government can keep its fiscal deficit under control, the more household savings it is opening up for infrastructure investment, which is off balance sheet, for example, and the less it is cannibalizing foreign money, which can then go into the corporate bond market to finance much needed public infrastructure.
All right, I am really running out of time here, and we'll ask each one of you to be a little brief there. And Dr. Kumar, like last time, there's a new narrative that the survey has tried to build. And the survey has, opened the discussion on judicial reforms and the need for them more ripe than ever before. It has raised a debate like it did on universal basic income last year. It talks about how judicial delays are taking a serious toll on growth, quote unquote. It talks about how 4% of India's GDP is locked in litigation. What is your take on that? Do you believe that begins a fresh new discourse on litigation and how the government is a big litigant?
I think this is much more relevant than the universal basic income, and the enforcement on contracts. Enforcement of contracts is a problem in our country. The judicial delays that we have, the long pendency that we have is something that we must take care of. I wish the economic survey had here also pointed out as to the percentage of legal cases in which government is involved, and in both of which the intergovernment, on both sides, it is the government parties that are involved, and I think that would be an important step to take, which is to resolve through out of court measures all the cases where government is itself involved, and to sort that out. And if that happens, we might well see the judicial system coming back to some degree of, if you like, normalcy, where the pendency is reduced.
Industry reaction from that, Ms. Kamineni, linking judicial delays to growth and the fact that they're taking a serious toll on growth. India, of course, ranks very poorly when it comes to enforcement of contracts as well. What are the reforms that you as a sort of CII president, specific judicial reforms that you'd like the government and judiciary to focus on?
I think that as much as judicial reforms are required, because if you see so many of the PPPs that were entered into are mired in legal disputes, these things need to be cleared up, arbitration laws, time bound, which now they've put in place. So we just need to be able to clear a lot of the backlog, and also moving forward, investors need a very clear line of sight that in India we have quick justice, and I think that the very fact that this bankruptcy code, the IBC, and that's a huge indicator, and I think that's been one of the great the boosts for predicting a better year next year, 7 to 7.5% next year.
I really am at the complete end of this debate, but I will have to take a final question to Jaggi. And Jaggi, printing the survey in pink and then talking about Indians who continue to have children till they have a son, talking about the adverse sex ratio of females to males that has led to 63 million missing women, talking about participation of women in workforce that has dwindled from 36% in fiscal year 2006 to 24% in fiscal year 2016 over 10 years. Are these all good things to do? I mean, printing the survey in print, talking about the obsession with a male child, is it a tick in the box, or do you believe that, having said this, the survey has really put the gender issue there, out in the open, to be a part of the narrative, to perhaps have policies finally being focused around that?
No, absolutely, because you see, if you see in every issue, the gender issue is getting bad attention. I mean, we have a female work participation rates of just about 25%, and that is probably costing us at least half to 1% of GDP. I mean, you got to start changing it from the societal angle to the workplace to all kinds of things. So I think we need to put gender issues almost at the top of the agenda. Without that, you are not going to get growth, and the kind of growth we need, 8 to 10%, is not going to happen without a shift in the emphasis on gender, and especially the female work participation rate, which is abysmally low in India, even lower than in places like Bangladesh.
It's not just a tick in the box approach. It hurts the country, it hurts our growth. We've done a few debates on that as well, and that's an issue that needs to be put on the spotlight. I can't thank this wonderful panel enough for being so patient and joining us on the India Development Debate this evening. Dr. Rajiv Kumar, Mr. Sunil Kant Munjal, Mr. Jagannathan, and of course Mr. Sajid Chinoy, and of course the President of CII, Ms. Shobna Kamineni, for joining us with your perspective on the India Development Debate on ET Now. The economic survey very often is a pointer to the budget. Quite often it's not as well. So we have to wait till the 1st of February to really find out if the Finance Minister has used this as a pointer or not. So all eyes on the Finance Minister now on the 1st of February. Supriya?
Indeed, the economic survey has really laid out the broad macroeconomic realities of the country and has egged the government to perhaps veer in the direction of harder reforms, more structural reforms that will take India into the next growth trajectory. That's really the broad message from the economic survey, which is now printed in pink, thanks to an ode to women who are missing in the workforce. But that's it then. It's a complete wrap. Up next is Top 10 at 10. Thank you very much for keeping your date with ET Now.
Good night.